Hello everybody, I just wanted to chat today about KX500 frames. These bikes have gotten real popular here recently. A lot of people are riding them, buying them. So I wanted to point out an issue with these frames. These issues stem back to the early days of Team Kawasaki, Team Green. A lot of my buddies that were former factory Team Green riders and racers on these bikes actually confirmed what I'm seeing here. This frame right here is Sean Collier's frame, and as you can see, we're having a little problem here where these shock linkage tabs are breaking off, and this one's on its way out. Where you can see right here, the factory pretty much just runs a weld across the bottom, across the top, and that is a bad place for that frame to break. This is primarily the reason why we had to go to a backup frame for the current build. I've heard a few suggestions on how they used to repair these or how they used to correct this. This coming from, again, people that were racing for Kawasaki, the Kawasaki factory. What they were one thing that I was told was that they were cutting out this whole section, the whole lower cradle. They were cutting out this whole section and basically rebuilding this whole section right here, the tabs and the lower tubes, out of chrome moly and welding them in. I heard from another individual that was also doing similar repairs and experiencing the same thing, that they would try to complete the weld where the factory only welds top and bottom. They were completing the weld on the sides, on the inside, top and bottom, all the way around, and that they were even gusseting. They were adding a gusset right here in this area. We are going to experiment with that. I'm going to take this frame, Sean's broken frame, to one of our fab shops with some engine cases mounted as a jig, and with the linkage mounted, because one issue with adding a gusset in this area is going to be clearance for the chain, as one of the chain rollers, the upper chain roller sits right here, which that won't be the problem, but the lower one sits right here. The lower chain roller runs right here, so the chain clearance might be an issue, so we need to really take that into consideration. Various reasons for why these are breaking. Again, there's not very much of a weld on there, for one. Two, today these bikes are really being ridden harder than they had originally been intended to ride. This chassis was designed, the first year this chassis was in 1988 until it was discontinued in 2002. Well, in 1988, the motocross tracks and the racers were not riding at the level that they are today, and even in the mid-90s, they were out riding the chassis. It's a 500cc two-stroke, so it puts out a lot of power. This frame flexes a lot, and especially if the motor's not, the crank's not balanced, it vibrates a lot. It's a two-stroke 500, so if you don't balance them, they'll vibrate a lot, and frames do not like that. So that's one of the many reasons why these are cracking. Another reason is improper shimming. Now, where the motors mount, you got mounting plates here. Where the motor mounts, you got the lower motor mounts up here. You got plates that come down. That's a motor mount. And then obviously your linkage mounts over here. I was told by one of my colleagues, Motorrad, that motorcycles and motorcycle engines are snowflakes. No two are alike, to a certain degree. These frames were mass produced in a factory, and it's not guaranteed that every single tab was put in the same location when you're talking, down to fractions of an inch or thousandths of an inch. Doesn't sound like much, but it actually can mean a lot. In a lot of cases, when the engines are finally put in, you'll have small gaps between the engine cases and the motor mounts themselves, and the same thing with the linkage. You'll have small gaps, and what people do is they'll usually just mount the engine, and then they'll just torque down on the bolts, and any small gaps that are in there, when they torque them down, they're actually pinching the frame down onto the engine. Well, when you're doing that, you end up putting the frame under tension. You end up bolting the frame under tension, and that will also help contribute to a lot of the cracks in the fractures and the failures. To alleviate that, I mean, there are shims, you know, like this one right here. This one's just 0.5 millimeter thick. But what the Kawasaki Team Green was doing is when they would mount their motors, they would actually shim the engines. They would place shims in between the spacers or in between the engine, down in the motor mount areas, and then also over in the linkage areas. Anywhere where the frame was going to bolt down to a solid location, they would shim them. So they would drop the engine in, they would put in the linkage and the swing arm, and they would look at all the gaps in between the frame and those locations, those mounting locations, and they would shim them up. That way they would take up the clearance, they would take up those gaps. So when they would tighten everything down, instead of tightening down the frame and squeezing the frame, those gaps were already filled in, so it wouldn't put any tension on the frame. Speaking to a former Team Green factory mechanic, he was telling me that they would shim and tighten down in various sequences and work their way from the front down all the way back to the linkage area. One case, the way they discovered this was they had a factory rider that was racing for Team Green at the time, Ty Davis, and he was out riding around on a KX500, and he said that he came in saying that the bike felt sticky, and they didn't understand what he was saying. So they were playing with the bike, you know, and they pushed down on the rear seat, on the rear of the seat, to see just check and sag and such. And when he tells me that when he pushed down on the bike didn't exactly spring back up, and they saw that there was some sort of bind in there. So he told me what they ended up doing is they ended up loosening. They started loosening all the linkage bolts and the swing arm bolt, and they just started loosening everything up. And as soon as they loosened everything up, the bike sprung up to its original position, to its correct position. So that's when they discovered that the frames were in a bind, and that's where the idea for the shimming, for all the shimming of the engine and everything, came into place. But yeah, I just wanted to go over that with everybody. Again, this is kind of a dangerous location for those tabs to break. I encourage everybody to take a look at that, you know, to inspect these areas if you're riding these old style Kawasaki chassis. These chassis were similar in the early KDXs, the early KX250s, the early KX125s, before they went to the perimeter frames. They were all essentially the same frame, with differences, of course. But for all the KX500 riders out there, I would definitely say that inspect these areas regularly. If yours is broken, get it fixed if you can, or replace the frame altogether. There should be a lot of rolling chassis out there. People are butchering these bikes and buying them just to yank the motor to make their AF projects, their aluminum frame projects. So you can find these frames, you know, reasonably priced on eBay if that is the case. For a lot of the other fellas out there that are machinists or fabricators that have an interest in this, I welcome any thoughts or any suggestions to reinforcing and strengthening this area so that this doesn't happen. I also noticed that this had been like this for a good while, because when I went ahead and mounted the linkage back up just to mock it up, I noticed that the linkage was tweaked over to the side. So these links right here, these tabs are all bent up. So this bike was not handling very well at all, and it was actually a bad situation. The entire rear suspension, the entire weight of the bike, all those forces were being supported by the engine cases and the swing arm pivot bolt, and the swing arm back here where it mounts to the swing arm itself, and not the frame. So that obviously once this fails, you know, the next weakest part in line is going to fail, and that could be the linkage. Could crack the case, you know, because again, it is also supported, as this sits here. The swing arm pivot bolt goes through here, and your engine cases mount here. Your swing arm sits in here in this gap. Well, these Kawasaki KX500 cases are not available anymore. So if this were to break and now it's putting all that stress on your case and you start cracking cases, now it's going to start getting expensive because again, they don't. Kawasaki's not selling these cases anymore. You can only find them used, and if you find them used, you just have to pray that they're in usable condition, or at least in good enough condition where they can be fixed or made serviceable. So again, in the comments, I welcome everybody to post up thoughts, concerns. If you go out to the garage right now and you look at your bike and you notice that yours are cracked too, I welcome comments. If anybody has any ideas or thoughts that they want to throw out there, feel free to throw them out there. This is something that I'd really like to look into and get corrected. Again, we are going to experiment with some gusseting and some reinforcement in this area, and I will be sure to post results on that.